The Weight of Silence by Heather Gudenkauf. Chapter 34. Calli. Calli slept fitfully. The ground was hard and unforgiving. Mosquitoes hovered around her exposed parts, though she had tried to tuck her legs underneath her nightgown, and they bit at her ankles and forearms. She dreamed intermittently of flying among the branches of the trees. She felt cool air on her forehead, and the pleasant swoop in her stomach that came with flight, like a tilt-a-whirl at the county fair. Below her, she could see the creek, cool and beckoning. She tried to will her body to fly down to the water so she could dive into it, but she could not. She continued to soar. Following the crooked path of the creek, she caught a glimpse of her father's fiery hair, and her stomach lurched in fear. He was looking up at her, anger etched on his face. She quickly passed over him and saw the rabbit-eared fawn drinking at the water's edge, its soft eyes calmly summoning her, and Calli winged down and hovered just a few feet above the deer. She reached out her hand to stroke its hide, but it darted out of her reach and into the woods. Calli tried to follow, the puff of its white tail raised in warning, her beacon. In and out of firs and buckeyes it twisted and turned. Calli concentrated to keep up. A hand snatched at her from behind and tried to grab at Calli, but only caught the hem of her nightgown. Looking over her shoulder, she could see that it was Petra, who was waving happily at her. Another hand clamped briefly on her arm, and her mother smiled up at her. Calli's flight slowed, but did not stop, and she momentarily spied her mother's hurt, confused look as she flew onward. Then the wood was filled with people who were familiar to her, grabbing her in a friendly way, like children chasing bubbles. There was Mrs. White, the school nurse, and her kindergarten teacher, and Mrs. Vega, her first-grade teacher, whom she loved dearly. Mr. Wilson, the school counselor, held her opened journal, pointing at something in it, but she couldn't see what it was. What was he pointing at? She so badly wanted to know. She tried to will her body to fly down toward Mr. Wilson and look at that journal, but she could not. She kept soaring onward. There was Mrs. Norland, Deputy Sheriff Lewis, Mr. and Mrs. Gregory, Jake Moon, Lena Hill, the librarian, all there reaching out for her. She peered through the thronging of people, searching for Ben, but she could not find him. Now there were people grasping at her that she did not know, and this was frightening to Calli. She tried to kick her feet and swim upward with her arms through the air. Onward she flew, following her doe. Soon she came to a beautiful clearing. Trees circled the small green meadow. A small pond was nestled in the center, and the fawn stopped for a drink. She was so thirsty, but could not pull herself down to the bank. Suddenly, Ben was there. Big, strong, kind Ben. He called to her. She tried to tell him that she was thirsty, so thirsty, but no words came. He seemed to know, though. Ben always seemed to know, and he dipped his hands into the water and pulled them out, cupped full of water. Still, Calli could not bring her body down to him, but he tossed the water up at her, and she caught a drop on her tongue. It was cold and sweet. Calli reached out for her brother, but it was as if she was filled with helium, and she kept rising, higher and higher above the treetops. Ben quickly began disappearing, his red hair a small flag below her. She continued to travel upward. The temperature rose as she rose, until she crashed into the sun. Calli awakened with a start, momentarily disoriented. She sat up and tried to wet her cracked lips, but her tongue was thick and heavy and held no moisture. Her dream had fled from her mind as she blinked herself awake, but was left with the comforting feeling that Ben was nearby. She stood slowly, her muscles tight, her feet sore. Downward, she decided, toward the water, and she began her slow descent down the bluff toward where she thought the creek may lay. As she walked gingerly along the path, avoiding broken twigs and jagged rocks, Calli recalled snatches of her dream, and the image of the school counselor, Mr. Wilson, holding her journal, pointing at something inside of it. At their first meeting, Mr. Wilson, a tall, thin man with bone-white hair and a long nose, invited her to sit next to him at the circular table in the guidance office. In front of them lay a black journal made with a rough, raspy paper with little natural fibers poking out. The book was held together with white, silky ribbon. Calli thought it was a beautiful book and longed to flip through the pages to see what was inside. Next to the journal lay a brand new box of colored chalk, not the thick variety that came in only 4 colors and was used for drawing on the sidewalk, but a real artist's set with wonderful, bright, rich colors. Her fingers itched to open the package. "Did you know, Calli," began Mr. Wilson, "that some of the best conversations people have are not with the spoken word?" He waited, as if expecting Calli to answer. Immediately, Calli became guarded. Last year's counselor, Mrs. Harrell, a mousy woman who wore only baggy clothes in shades of gray and tan, would wait for Calli to answer as well. She never did, though. "Calli, I'm not going to get you to try and talk," Mr. Wilson said, as if reading her mind. He rubbed his long nose with one extended fingertip and looked at her straight in the eyes. Mrs. Harrell never even seemed to look at Calli's face, always talked to her while jotting notes down in a notebook. Mr. Wilson's straightforward manner unsettled Calli a bit. "I do want to get to know you, though," he continued. "That's my job, to try and get to know the students, and to help them if I can." "Oh, don't look so suspicious, Calli," Mr. Wilson chuckled. "Talking is overrated. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, listening to people talking all day? Then I go home and listen to my wife talking, and my kids talking, and my dog talking." He slid his eyes toward Calli, who wrinkled her nose and smiled at the image of Mr. Wilson listening to a black lab or German shepherd sitting at the kitchen table talking about its day. Okay, so my dog doesn't talk, but everyone else does. So this quiet will be good for me, I thought, he said, stretching his lean legs under the table. That we could have this journal here and write to each other, kind of like pen pals, but without envelopes and stamps. Our conversations could be right in here. He tapped the journal with one finger. What do you think, Calli? Don't answer that. Think about it. Decorate the cover. Whatever. I'm just gonna sit over here at my desk and work and enjoy the quiet. Mr. Wilson smiled encouragingly, stood, and went to his old oak desk in the corner of his office. He settled his long frame into a chair and tucked his legs underneath the steel-framed chair, bent his slender neck over the contents of a file folder, and began to read. Calli regarded the book in front of her. She loved to draw pictures and write stories. She could write lots of words, even though she was only in the first grade. She wrote stories about horses, and fairies, and cities under the ocean. She never had a pen pal, never even wrote to her father while he was away. That had never occurred to her. She couldn't imagine that anyone wanted to hear what she had to say, as if the words she said would somehow drip jewels. She flipped open the journal. Its creamy, unlined pages were oddly welcoming. The pages contained the same flecks of fibers that were in the cover, each page uniquely flawed. She softly closed the book, and her attention shifted to the chalk in front of her, selecting a purple that held the same shimmer as the dragonflies down at Willow Creek. She held it in her fingers, admiring it. In the lower right-hand corner, she slowly printed her name with great care. Calli. She glanced up at Mr. Wilson, who was still engrossed in his paperwork. Calli carefully replaced the purple chalk back into the box and wiped the excess dust from her fingers onto her jeans, leaving iridescent streaks. She pushed her chair back from the table, stood, picked up the journal, and carried it over to Mr. Wilson. She held it out to him. "Just set it over there, Calli," he said, indicating the round table. "We'll meet again on Thursday. Have a good day." Calli paused. Was that all? "No, you need to speak now, Calli. You're worrying your mother needlessly. Stop this nonsense. There's nothing wrong with you. Just have a good day?" Calli turned away from Mr. Wilson and gently laid the book on the table, gave a small breath of relief, and walked out the door. Calli spent 2 half-hour sessions a week with Mr. Wilson, writing and drawing pictures in her journal. Often he would draw a picture or write back to her, only if she asked him to in writing. Her favorite pictures and writings were about his dog named Bart. He told tales of Bart being able to open doors with his paws, and the time when he was begging at the dining room table and actually said the word hamburger in his little dog voice. Sometimes, Calli would have to point at a word for Mr. Wilson to read to her, but most often, she could read what he wrote on her own. She looked forward to beginning the 2nd grade and her meetings with Mr. Wilson. She felt safe in his quiet little room with her chalk, a sharpened pencil, and her journal. Mr. Wilson had said he would keep the journal over the summer, and that it would be waiting for her when school began again. She had written to him during their second-to-last meeting of her first grade year, asking him what they were going to do when the journal was filled up. He'd replied, "Get a new one, of course." She had smiled at that. Calli wondered what Mr. Wilson had been pointing at in her dream. Which page in the journal was he trying to show to her? She didn't know. They had written so much in it, none of it particularly important. Not to an adult, anyway. Except Mr. Wilson had a way of making you feel as if everything you wrote and did was important. A ground squirrel skittered by and startled Calli. She listened for the gurgle of the creek, but heard nothing but the cicadas' steady thrumming. Downward, she told herself. Downward is where the creek will be, with cold water and silver fish. Maybe she'd see a frog and shimmering purple dragonflies that sparkled as they skimmed the water. Downward.